The storm outside the Murtala Muhammad International Airport was less of a weather event and more of a physical barrier. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the executive lounge, blurring the runway lights into a smeared neon mess. Inside, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and over-roasted coffee. Anuli Okafor stared at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. She looked professional, composed, and entirely terrified. In her inbox, the RSVP for the Virex Systems Gala sat like a ticking bomb. She had already typed the lie. "I'll be attending with my partner." You're overthinking the response. It's a binary choice, yes or no. The voice was deep, resonant, and carried an accent that was smooth as polished stone. Anuli didn't jump. She was too disciplined for that. She simply shifted her gaze. The man sitting 3 feet away was an island of stillness in a room of agitated travelers. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than her entire college tuition, his long legs crossed with a casualness that suggested he owned the floor beneath him. He didn't look at her. He was focused on the amber liquid in his glass. "I didn't realize my internal monologue was that loud," Anuli said, her voice dry. "It's not your voice, it's your grip," he replied, finally turning his head. His eyes were dark, observant, and unsettlingly calm. "You've been holding that phone like a detonator for 20 minutes. Anuli felt a flicker of heat in her chest. Usually, she was the one doing the observing. Being read so easily by a stranger was an unwelcome novelty. "It's a reunion, an old firm. I told them I was bringing someone I don't actually have." "Why lie?" "Because being the woman who was passed over is one thing," Anuli said, her pride flaring despite herself. "Being the woman who stayed stagnant for 5 years is another. I want them to see me as someone they can't touch." The man set his whiskey down. The ice clinked, a sharp, singular sound. "Pride is a valid investment, provided you can back the currency." He extended a hand, his movements precise. "So Ji-hwan." "Anuli," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, brief, and sent a jolt of awareness up her arm. "I have a 12-hour delay and a distaste for small talk, Anuli," Ji-hwan said, leaning back. The light caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "If you need a man who looks like he belongs in a room where men like Marcus thrive, and subsequently makes them feel small, I am available." Anuli blinked, caught between a laugh and a gasp. "You don't even know who Marcus is." "I know the type. They're inefficient." He signaled the waiter for another glass. "Will you pretend to be my boyfriend for one night? That was the question on your tongue, wasn't it?" Anuli took a breath. The storm roared outside, but the silence between them was louder. "And the cost?" "A glass of this whiskey," Ji-hwan said, his eyes locking onto hers with a predatory focus. "And the chance to see how the story ends." The hotel suite was a cathedral of glass and minimalist marble, overlooking a city that seemed to shrink beneath So Ji-hwan's silhouette. He didn't pace. He occupied space with a terrifying efficiency. On the bed lay a garment bag that had arrived via a silent courier an hour prior. "I told you I have my own clothes," Anuli said, her voice echoing slightly against the high ceilings. She felt small in the center of the room, her hand clutching the strap of her laptop bag, her habitual shield. Ji-hwan turned, his gaze traveling over her with the clinical detachment of an architect surveying a foundation. "You have clothes that help you disappear, Anuli. Tonight we are not hiding, we are declaring." He unzipped the bag. Inside was a dress the color of midnight, silk so heavy it poured like liquid. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream for attention. It was structured, architectural, and devastatingly precise. "It's too much," she whispered. "It is a uniform," he corrected, stepping closer. The scent of sandalwood and cold air followed him. "When you walk into Virex, they will look for the girl they sidelined. If they find her, they win. You must give them someone they don't recognize, so they have no choice but to listen." Anuli took the dress. When she emerged from the dressing room 20 minutes later, the air in the suite seemed to thin. The silk clung to her curves before falling into a sharp, straight hem. Her deep brown skin glowed against the dark fabric, and the understated gold jewelry Ji Huan had selected caught the light like suppressed fire. He didn't offer a compliment. He simply nodded once. "Now, our history." He sat on the velvet sofa and indicated the seat opposite him. For the next hour, they didn't just talk. They calibrated. "We met in London," Ji Huan stated, his voice dropping into a lower, more intimate register. "At a gallery opening. You were unimpressed by the centerpiece. I was unimpressed by the crowd. We spent 3 hours arguing about the intersection of aesthetics and utility." Anuli watched his mouth move, mesmerized by the ease with which he wove a life for them. "I like that," she murmured. "It sounds like me." "It is you," he said softly. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from him. "Tell me one thing about me that only a partner would know. Not for them, for us. So your eyes don't lie when I touch your waist." Anuli hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at his hands, strong, steady, capable of buying a world or breaking one. "You don't like the silence," she ventured, her voice a breathy velvet. "You fill it with observation because you're afraid of missing a threat." Ji Huan's eyes darkened. For the first time, his composure fractured, just a hairline crack. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. The touch wasn't a caress. It was a claim. "Good," he rasped. "Keep that fire. It's the only thing in that room worth more than the company itself." The glass doors of the Grand Meridian ballroom swung open, venting a slipstream of artificial jasmine and the forced laughter of people who spent their lives climbing over one another. Anuli felt the weight of the silk against her skin, a heavy, dark reminder of the woman she had agreed to become for the evening. Beside her, Ji Huan was a pillar of absolute shadow. He didn't offer his arm. Instead, he walked half a step behind her, a placement that felt less like an escort and more like a tactical shadow. His presence was a physical pressure, a silent command for the room to yield. They hadn't crossed 10 feet of the polished floor before the crowd parted. Marcus stood there, a flute of champagne in one hand and a smirk that hadn't changed in 5 years. He looked exactly like the man who had deleted Anuli's name from the patent filing, loud, expensive, and hollow. "Anuli? Anuli Okafor?" Marcus's voice boomed, intended to draw a circle of witnesses. He scanned her from head to toe, his eyes lingering on the silk with a sneer of disbelief. "My God, look at you. I heard you went freelance. I suppose that's the polite word for between roles these days." The circle of former colleagues rippled with quiet, uncomfortable chuckles. Anuli felt the old, familiar coldness settling in her limbs, the urge to shrink, to explain, to justify. But then, the air behind her shifted. Ji Huan stepped into the light. He didn't say a word. He simply came to a halt at Anuli's side, his hand coming to rest lightly, possessively, on the small of her back. The heat of his palm burned through the silk, anchoring her. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked through him, his expression one of bored, aristocratic indifference. The silence stretched. It became heavy, then suffocating. Marcus's smirk wavered, then curdled. He looked at Ji-hwan's watch, then at the cut of his charcoal suit, and finally at the terrifyingly calm eyes of a man who clearly didn't recognize Marcus as a peer. "And who is this?" Marcus asked, his voice losing its projection, dropping an octave into something defensive. "This is So Ji-hwan," Anuli said, her voice finding its edge, sharp and clear as a bell. "My partner, Ji-hwan, this is Marcus. He used to manage my department back when I was learning what I didn't want to become." Ji-hwan's gaze finally settled on Marcus. It was like a spotlight hitting a moth. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He didn't offer a greeting. "I see," Ji-hwan said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I've heard much about Virex, Marcus. I was under the impression the leadership was more substantial." The room went dead silent. Marcus opened his mouth to retort, but found himself physically unable to meet Ji-hwan's stare. He took a half step back, the king of the office suddenly looking like a child in a borrowed suit. Ji-hwan leaned down, his lips brushing Anuli's ear in a gesture that looked intimate, but felt like a command. "The room is yours, Anuli. I'm just here to make sure no one forgets it." The dining hall was an arena of silver and crystal, where the elite of Virex systems sat gathered like a court. Anuli sat to the right of the chairman, with Ji-hwan positioned directly across from Marcus. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound as the first course was served, a fragile piece that Marcus, emboldened by a third glass of wine, decided to break. "It's a shame you left when you did, Anuli," Marcus said, leaning forward, his voice carrying just enough to capture the attention of the surrounding board members. "We've pivoted since then. We're leaner, high-level strategy only. I'm not sure you'd even recognize the architecture anymore." Anuli felt the familiar sting of his condescension, but before she could formulate a response, Ji-hwan spoke. He hadn't touched his food. He was watching Marcus with the terrifying stillness of a shark beneath a glass-bottom boat. "Architecture is an interesting word choice, Marcus," Ji-hwan said. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room's ambient noise like a blade. "I've been reviewing Virex's recent quarterly performance, specifically the 62% drop-off rate at the integration stage of your primary platform. That suggests your lean strategy is actually a fundamental failure in UX retention." Marcus blinked, his face flushing a mottled red. Those are internal figures, and retention is a secondary metric in this phase. We're focused on acquisition. "Acquiring users you cannot keep is merely an expensive way to fail," Ji-hwan replied smoothly. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Anuli mentioned that 5 years ago, she proposed a predictive mapping system that addressed exactly this friction. You shelved it, citing cost inefficiency. Since then, your churn rate has doubled. Tell me, Marcus, how do you justify that loss to your board while claiming the architecture is superior?" The chairman paused, his fork hovering mid-air, his gaze shifting sharply to Marcus. The air in the room grew cold. Marcus stammered, his hands fidgeting with his napkin. "The market shifted. It wasn't about the UX. It was a capital issue." "It was a competence issue," Ji-hwan corrected. His tone remained conversational, which made the insult devastating. "You dismantled the research department because you couldn't understand the data Anuli was providing. You traded long-term stability for short-term optics. From an investment standpoint, it's not just an error, it's negligence. Anuli watched, breathless, as the man who had once loomed over her career like a giant seemed to shrink until he was nothing more than a panicked employee. Ji-hwan wasn't just defending her, he was deconstructing Marcus's entire professional identity, using the very weapons Marcus had stolen from her. As Marcus fell into a humiliated silence, Ji-hwan turned his gaze to Anuli. For a fleeting second, the predatory sharpness vanished, replaced by a dark, private pride. He had stripped the room of its power and handed the reins to her. The gala's orchestra transitioned into a slow, haunting arrangement of strings that seemed to pull the remaining air from the room. Marcus had retreated to the bar, his ego visible in the slumped line of his shoulders. But Anuli felt no triumph, only a strange, vibrating hum in her nerves. When Ji-hwan stood and extended a hand, it wasn't an invitation, it was a rescue. He led her to the center of the floor, away from the prying eyes of the board and the hushed whispers of her peers. As his hand settled firmly on her waist and her palm found the cool, expensive wool of his shoulder, the world of Virex systems simply fell away. The heavy scent of his cologne, rainwater and dark cedar became her entire horizon. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a low vibration she felt in her chest more than she heard in her ears. "I didn't expect you to go that far," Anuli replied, her eyes fixed on the knot of his silk tie. "You didn't just defend my work, you eviscerated him with it." "He was using a masterpiece to prop up a tent," Ji-hwan said. He pulled her a fraction closer, narrowing the gap until their breaths mingled in the space between them. "I have no patience for waste." Anuli finally looked up, meeting those dark, impenetrable eyes. In the flickering candlelight of the ballroom, the clinical detachment she had seen in the airport was gone. In its place was something raw and unsettlingly focused. This wasn't the look of a man playing a role. This was the look of a man who had stopped looking for anything else. "We're supposed to be pretending, Ji-hwan," she whispered, the words feeling like a thin lie even as she spoke them. "Are we?" He slowed their movement until they were barely swaying, a private island in a sea of silk and shadows. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate arc across the small of her back, a touch that felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. "The contract was for a boyfriend, Anuli, but I don't remember agreeing to a script. Everything I said at that table was true. Everything I'm feeling right now is not part of the deal." The pull was terrifying. It was a gravitational force, a desire to lean into his strength and let the world burn outside their circle. For a woman who had spent 5 years building walls of independence, the urge to surrender to his gravity felt like a betrayal of her own soul. Yet, as his hand tightened slightly, anchoring her against him, Anuli realized the danger wasn't Marcus or the company. The danger was the man holding her, and the fact that she no longer wanted to be let go. The music didn't fade so much as it was severed. A sharp chime rang through the ballroom, and the chairman, a man whose silver hair usually signaled unshakable confidence, stepped onto the podium. He looked shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Anuli felt Ji-hwan's hand slip from her waist, though he remained close enough for his heat to prickle against her skin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman began, his voice strained. "I had intended for tonight to be a celebration of our legacy. However, as of 20 minutes ago, the board has finalized an emergency session. Due to a series of aggressive market movements and a direct tender offer that could not be refused, Virex Systems has been acquired." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Marcus, standing near the stage, turned a ghostly shade of gray. "Effective immediately," the chairman continued. "We are a subsidiary of SJH Holdings. Our new majority stakeholder is already among us tonight." Anuli felt the world tilt. SJH. The initials hit her like a physical blow. She turned to look at the man standing beside her. Ji-hwan wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes as deep and dark as the Atlantic at midnight. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. "You," Anuli breathed, the word barely a whisper. "The airport. The delay. You didn't just happen to be there." Ji-hwan didn't flinch. "I told you I was in town for an acquisition, Anuli. I simply hadn't decided whether to finalize the paperwork until I saw how they treated their most valuable assets." "You bought a multinational corporation because of a dinner conversation?" Her voice rose, laced with a cocktail of awe and burgeoning fury. "This wasn't a favor. This was a hostile takeover. You used me to do your due diligence." "I used the truth to confirm a mathematical certainty," Ji-hwan replied smoothly, stepping closer. The crowd was now staring at them, the realization dawning on her former colleagues like a slow-motion wreck. They were undervalued because they were led by fools. "I don't buy companies, Anuli. I harvest potential." "And what am I?" Anuli asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "A line item in your new portfolio? A piece of the potential you harvested?" The chairman was calling Ji-hwan to the stage, but Ji-hwan ignored him, his focus entirely on the woman in the midnight silk dress. "You are the only person in this room who isn't for sale," he said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, intimate register. "But the company that broke you? That I could afford." He turned and began to walk toward the podium, the crowd parting like the Red Sea before him. Anuli stood frozen in the center of the floor, realizing that the shield she had hired wasn't just a protector. He was the new owner of her nightmare. The cool, sterile air of the hotel balcony was a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Anuli stood with her back to the city, her hands gripping the railing so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. Behind her, the glass door slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. "The board is waiting for a statement," Ji-hwan said. His voice was calm, devoid of the adrenaline that usually follows a billion-dollar coup. "They are terrified. It's a look that suits them." Anuli spun around, the midnight silk of her dress snapping like a whip. "Is that what this was? A performance review? You didn't come to that reunion to be my boyfriend, Ji-hwan. You came to audit the books. I was just the tour guide who showed you where the bodies were buried." Ji-hwan stepped into the moonlight, his features cast in sharp, unforgiving angles. "I am a businessman, Anuli. I saw an inefficiency, and I corrected it. You provided the data that proved the leadership was obsolete. Why does that anger you? You wanted justice. I delivered it." "I wanted my dignity!" Anuli's voice broke the quiet of the night, raw and trembling. "I wanted to stand in that room and be enough on my own. Instead, you turned my trauma into a market opportunity. You didn't save me. You bought the ground I'm standing on so I'd have nowhere else to go. You made me your excuse for a hostile takeover." "You are oversimplifying the mechanics of power," he said, his eyes narrowing. He moved toward her, his presence closing the distance until she was trapped between him and the ledge. "I didn't need an excuse to buy Virex. I bought it because it belonged to you, and they were holding it hostage." "Don't wrap this in chivalry," she spat, her eyes flashing. "You don't do anything without a return on investment. What's the ROI on me, Ji-hwan? Do I sit in the lobby? Do I become the face of your new acquisition? I refuse to be a trophy you won in a corporate raid. I spent 5 years fighting to be seen, and in one night, you've made me invisible again. Just the girl the CEO took a liking to. Ji-hwan reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her face, before he pulled back, a rare moment of hesitation. You think I did this to diminish you? I think you did this because you can't help yourself, she whispered. You don't know how to relate to something you don't control. You didn't just buy a company, Ji-hwan. You tried to buy the ending to my story, and I'm not signing the contract. She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing his chest, a final, defiant spark of the electricity that had nearly fooled her. She didn't look back to see if he followed. For the first time that night, the silence between them wasn't a shared secret, it was a wall. The silence of the suite was different now, not the charged, anticipatory hum of the airport, but a heavy, mourning stillness. Ji-hwan was standing by the window when Anuli returned to retrieve her things. He hadn't changed out of his suit, but he had loosened his tie, a rare concession that made him look less like a monolith and more like a man. My mother was a researcher at a firm much like Virex, he said, his voice cutting through the dark. He didn't turn around. She spent 20 years building their foundation. When the merger came, a man like Marcus, a man who couldn't explain the science but could charm the board, decided she was redundant. He took her data, rebranded it, and retired on the dividends while she died in a small apartment, still trying to prove she existed. Anuli stopped, her hand hovering over her bag. The anger in her chest flickered, meeting a cold, familiar grief in his. I didn't buy Virex because I can't help myself, Anuli, he said, finally turning. The moonlight caught the exhaustion in his eyes. I buy companies like Virex because I promised myself I would never let that cycle complete itself again. I am a predator, yes, but I only hunt what deserves to be consumed. He walked toward the marble desk and picked up a single embossed folder. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the edge of the table between them, a bridge made of paper. This is the appointment of the new chief executive officer for the subsidiary, he said. The board thinks I'm installing a puppet. They expect a name they can control. I've left the space blank. Anuli looked at the document, then back at him. You think a title fixes this? You think I want to be the beneficiary of your revenge? I don't give gifts, Anuli. I make investments, Ji-hwan replied, his voice regaining its steel. I'm not offering you this because I want to own you. I'm offering it because I've spent the last 6 hours looking at your original research, and it is the only thing in that building with actual value. If you walk away, I'll liquidate the company by morning. I'll sell the assets, fire everyone, including Marcus, and turn the building into a parking lot. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. But if you stay, you take the chair. You implement the predictive mapping you designed. You build the firm they were too stupid to let you create. You won't be my trophy. You'll be my partner. And for the first time in your life, you won't have to ask for permission to be seen. The weight of the choice was staggering. It was the agency she had craved, wrapped in the protection she had feared. Anuli looked at the blank line on the contract, then at the man who had burned down a kingdom just to give her the ashes. If I sign, she whispered, I do it on my terms. No scripts, no pretending. Anuli, he said, his hand finally finding hers, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist. I stopped pretending the moment we left the airport. The lobby of Virex Systems felt different when you owned the air inside it. On Monday morning, the glass and chrome atrium was silent, the usual frantic buzz replaced by a heavy, expectant hush. The news of the acquisition had traveled through the industry like a flash fire, and as Anuli walked through the revolving doors, the security guards, men who had once barely glanced at her badge, now stood at attention, their gazes fixed somewhere over her shoulder. She wasn't wearing the midnight silk. She was in a tailored charcoal blazer and sharp trousers, her hair pulled back into a sleek, no-nonsense knot. She looked like the strategist she had always been, but her heart was a chaotic rhythm against her ribs. When she reached the executive floor, the glass doors slid open to reveal a gauntlet of familiar faces. Marcus was there, standing outside his office, his face a mask of poorly concealed panic. The board members who had laughed at the dinner table now hovered near the conference room, clutching tablets like shields. "Anuli," Marcus stammered, stepping forward, his voice stripped of its booming authority. We've been waiting for the new representative from SJH to arrive, to discuss the transition." Anuli didn't stop. She walked past him, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence on the hard wood. She stopped at the door of the corner office, the one Marcus had occupied for 5 years. She turned to face the room, her expression unreadable. "The representative is here," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the floor. "And we aren't discussing a transition. We are discussing a restructuring." She stepped into the office and sat behind the desk. It was too large, the leather too cold, the view too expansive. She looked at the signature line on the appointment letter she had signed that morning. The ink was dry, but the doubt was still wet. Did I earn this? She wondered, her gaze drifting to the empty chair across from her, where she imagined Ji Huan sitting, watching her with that unsettling, supportive calm. She realized then that the office wasn't a gift. It was a battlefield. Ji Huan hadn't handed her a victory. He had handed her the weapon she had been denied 5 years ago. Whether she won the war would depend on the work, not the title. Marcus hovered in the doorway, looking smaller than she ever remembered. "I suppose you'll want my resignation?" Anuli looked at him, and for the first time, she felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, only a profound sense of clarity. "I don't want your resignation, Marcus," she said, opening her laptop to the predictive mapping files they had once deleted. "I want your metrics for the last quarter. By noon. If they aren't on my desk, don't bother coming back after lunch." As he scurried away, Anuli felt a vibration in her pocket, a text from Ji Huan. "The view is better from the top. Don't forget to breathe." She didn't reply. She just started to work. The airport lounge was exactly as it had been 2 weeks ago. Filtered air, the distant roar of turbines, and the same smeared neon lights reflecting against the rain-slicked glass. But as Anuli walked toward the familiar corner table, the weight she had carried for half a decade was gone, replaced by a sharp, electric clarity. Ji Huan was there, a glass of amber whiskey untouched before him. He didn't look up until she sat down, and when he did, the clinical observation in his eyes had softened into something resembling respect. "You're late," he said, though there was no edge to his voice. "I had to finalize the termination papers for Marcus and 3 of his directors," Anuli replied, setting her slim briefcase on the table. "And I had to sign off on the first phase of the mapping integration. The board is terrified of me. It's a look that suits them." Ji Huan's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "I told you it would." "You did." Anuli leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "But we need to discuss the terms of our arrangement moving forward." The pretend contract is void, and the acquisition is finalized. So, what happens now, Ji-hwan? Are you flying back to Seoul to wait for your dividends? Ji-hwan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He slid it across the table toward her. I have 14 other acquisitions in progress across 3 continents. None of them require my personal presence. None of them involve a CEO who challenges my methodology before breakfast. Anuli opened the notebook. It wasn't filled with data or market projections. It was a list of names, locations, and dates. It was a travel itinerary. Her name was next to his for every stop. You're proposing a global expansion, she noted, her voice steady despite the flutter in her pulse. I'm proposing a partnership, he corrected. SJH Holdings needs a chief strategist who understands that people aren't just variables in an equation. And I find I have a distaste for traveling alone. Anuli closed the notebook and slid it back. I'll take the position, but under one condition. Ji-hwan raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. Name it. No more grand gestures without my consent. No more buying companies to settle my debts. If we do this, we do it as equals. You don't protect me, Ji-hwan. You stand beside me. The silence that followed was long, measured, and for the first time, entirely balanced. Ji-hwan picked up his glass and held it out in a silent toast. To the new contract, he murmured. Anuli clinked her glass against his, the sound sharp and clear above the hum of the airport. The storm was still raging outside, but as they stood to catch their flight, she realized she wasn't afraid of the wind anymore. She was the one directing the gale. By the way, she said as they walked toward the gate, her shoulder brushing his in a way that was no longer an act. You still owe me for that first glass of whiskey. Ji-hwan didn't look back, but his hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a firm, certain grip. Put it on my tab, CEO. We have a long way to go.